Welcome to the HCI family of podcasts. We're your source for personal, professional, and organizational growth and development. We share our own original research, explore industry trends, and interview executives and thought leaders from across the globe. Join us for practitioner-oriented content around all things leadership, HR, talent management, organizational development, and change management. Maximize your personal and organizational potential with the HCI family of podcasts. Sarah Adler, welcome to the conversation today.
Thanks so much for having me.
It is a pleasure to be with you. You're joining us from California. I'm south of Salt Lake City in Utah. And today we're going to be talking about supporting mental health in the modern workplace. This is a super important conversation that we need to be having. We've had it on occasion on this podcast in the past. I think it's one that we need to have repeatedly. And it's one that I think is ever evolving. Over the last few years, we've had it in particular related to the pandemic. So as lockdowns happened, as we're social distancing and we're trying to figure out how do we deal with social distancing and pandemic related challenges, there was a lot of attention given to mental health issues, anxiety, stress, all of that. And I think some of that has started to fade to the background as, all of those lockdowns opened back up, as things got kind of back to quote unquote normal, right? But it wasn't just the pandemic, right? There were all sorts of things that were contributing to the mental health crisis. We have a loneliness epidemic throughout the world. We have social media that is contributing to all sorts of negative mental health outcomes. We have burnout crisis in organizations. And we just have, simply put, I think, a level of complexity, a level of constant disruption in the world today and in the workplace that leads to a constant state of, I think, stress and anxiety in a lot of people. And so all of this contributes to really what I think most people experience in one way or another, and that is some form of mental health issues that we need to all be attentive to. So whether that's kind of a relatively minor amount of just mental health, kind of proactive wellness, attentiveness that we need to be paying attention to personally, or as a supervisor, a manager, or as a coworker looking out for our colleagues, or to really serious stuff, right? Where we have to be paying attention and helping and supporting each other. All of this is something that is just so super serious that we need to be looking out for each other. And I'll also say, just on the outset, as we're getting started, it's, certainly it matters from a business case perspective. So if we're talking about just dollars and cents, bottom line, is this good for business? Is this good for the organization? 100% absolutely. We'll unpack that a little bit more in the conversation. It's good for business. But also from a human perspective, the human case is also 100% clear. If we're going to just recognize the humanity of each other, we need to focus on this as well. So from both standpoints, this is something we need to continue to focus on. This is your expertise. I'm so thrilled to have you sitting down with me today so we can discuss this. As we get started, I wanted to share Sarah's bio with everybody. Dr. Sarah Adler is CEO and founder of Wave Life, a mental health platform that pairs affordable and quality coaching with engaging and immersive skill building for Gen Z. She is a licensed clinical psychologist and former hedge fund analyst obsessed with improving access to high-quality mental health care. Dr. Adler is a clinical associate professor of psychiatry at Stanford University. She sits on the advisory board of Redesign Health and the board of directors of Empathic, using AI to improve empathic communication at scale. Previously, Sarah was CCO at National Behavioral Health Startup and founding partner, Peninsula Behavioral Health, a group practice providing evidence-based care to the San Francisco Bay Area. This is a tremendous background. I could go on, but I'm going to pause there. Anything else you would like to share by way of your background or personal context before we dive on in further?
Nah, I think my LinkedIn profile says it all. So it encapsulates everything you ever need to know about me, right? So we're all good.
Awesome. And I do want to just double down and highlight on, this isn't, from my point of view, I'm a professor, I'm in the organizational space, HR, that stuff. And so, I talk about this from an organizational expertise, but I have no clinical background. I have no, therapist background, but you do. You are a doctor of psychiatry. At Stanford, you have all of that background. You have expertise in this area. So I think between the two of us, we can really tackle, what this means for organizations. So let's
Absolutely.
start there. Um, Tell us a little bit more about really why you started Wave Life. So you're CEO and founder of Wave Life, this mental health platform, and you're focusing on Gen Z. So why Gen Z? Why Wave Life?
Well, we started in Gen Z, and this circles back, I think there were four themes that you sort of touched on in your introduction about why this is happening and why it's so important. And we started off with Gen Z because Gen Z is sort of the fulcrum, or is at the sort of the inciting generation that is driving mental health into sort of the national discussion. And you
Mm,
sort of identified, I think quite rightly, the shift that occurred during COVID. But it was a shift that was happening even before COVID, whereas
yeah.
this younger generation was starting to talk about mental health in a very, very different way, and even demanding to have their mental health be looked at as not as something that was stigmatic, but as something that was actually part of everyday use. And that sort of leads us into one of the second themes that you talked about, which is this idea that mental health is not an acute phase issue. It shouldn't be looked at just as when something terrible happens or I have a mental health incident that I suddenly get treatment, but starting to weave it into sort of the quotidian, the everyday life, ups and downs of life, and kind of looking at it from a preventative standpoint, from an acute phase standpoint, and then also from a maintenance standpoint. And that's actually where we got our name WAVE from, is that
Mhm.
mental health should actually be looked at almost as a sine wave. It's something that waxes and wanes. It's not just about what's happening to us internally. There are tremendous systemic factors, environmental factors, and that impact our mental health. We tend to think of it as very individualistic, which I think is a mistake. Another theme
Mm,
you kind of touched on, especially within organizations as well. And that's why I founded Wave. I got really tired of hearing about kind of this disconnect, especially with HR professionals who are, let's be honest. Actually, I had a fabulous HR professional tell me yesterday that they're the corporate therapist. So their job is on the front lines, and it really shouldn't be. And so there was this really
right.
big disconnect around these HR professionals who are really on the front line of corporations, kind of in charge and empowered with creating culture and creating solutions to fix the bottom line and to fix what's happening for their employees, but given really different tool sets and also kind of envisioning that as almost two separate things. And this kind of goes to one of the third themes that you talked about, which is how do we actually incorporate mental health into the culture of a workplace to improve not only the health of the workplace, but the bottom line. In my mind, and we can delve into this further, those two things are not orthogonal at all and can be
Yeah.
aligned really beautifully in order to drive real cultural change, which impacts the bottom line because in the like realistic picture, as I tell my employees all the time, yes, we want a healthy, cultural, thriving workplace, but if the lights aren't on, it doesn't matter.
And you're absolutely right. From an HR perspective, should HR folks be the therapists of the organization? Absolutely not. By default, they often become so.
Right.
And that's unfortunate because they don't have that training or that background. They're just kind of often thrown into the role of like trying to be the go-between and trying to like help out in any way they possibly can. But there's specialty training, as you well know, because that's your area. And so obviously, within organizations, anything that's related to people and well-being often ends up on the plate of people and culture or HR, the HR department. Hopefully, a good HR department will know when they have the expertise and when they don't have the expertise, and when to reach out to outside resources, and when to direct people to other areas, right?
Yeah, and I think, and that actually goes to the last theme that I think you touched on really beautifully, which is this really kind of tough conundrum that HR professionals are in, where they're also responsible for this huge legal component of
Hmm.
doing things legally, doing things right, and this idea that the human thing to do is often at odds with what is actually best for the organization. So it puts them in a really hard position where the employee also doesn't know, is this person actually here for me or is this person here for the company? And I don't even think the jobs are that. I don't even think the HR's professional always even knows the answer to that question either. So they're put into a
Sure.
really very tough position. But I think that the last theme that you really touched on, which is it's kind of quite beautiful, is this idea that there has been this tectonic shift in bringing culture into organizations as a means to drive productivity, as a means to kind of make the organization better as well. And I think you're sort of dead on with that. And then the idea or the question is really, how do you do that in a way that is really demonstrating an ROI? So all of these solutions that are out there, how do you do that in a way that demonstrates an ROI so that you can then go to your CFO or your CEO and say, hey, yeah, we know theoretically that this is actually something that is going to impact us in a very positive way, but like, where are the numbers to back it up? And so I think that that's actually fundamentally important to any solution that companies should be asking for any mental health solution that they are paying for, either through a carve out with their insurance or through just as an added benefit, is like, where's the ROI? How are you demonstrating it? And that will make everyone's lives kind of much easier.
Yeah, yeah. And obviously that's going to be on a company by company basis. So I can tell you, generally speaking, there's a lot of research on this. So generally speaking, across firms in the aggregate, there's a lot of ROI across, things like turnover rates and things like burnout and withdrawal cognition and level of performance, things like creativity and innovation. There's a lot of general positive effect, of people who have higher levels of functioning, stronger mental health. And those who are struggling and suffering, they tend to have higher levels of burnout. They tend to have, higher levels of absenteeism, higher levels of withdrawal cognition, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? But you need to be able to demonstrate that on a case by case basis, on an organizational basis.
That's
Um,
right.
you can't you can't just rely on the generalities. And I see people do that a lot. They try to point to like a study and they say, "See, this matters," and that's not going to cut it, for a CFO or a CEO who says, "Well, what about our business?"
That's right.
So how can you tie those specific metrics and the specific ROI to your company? That's a little harder. That's a little trickier to do, but it can be done. And so just
Absolutely.
spend some time and effort really focusing on that, and then your case can be really strong. So you, like you said, it's not an either or. You can focus on the people, you can focus on the bottom line, and it becomes a no-brainer at that point that you're going to absolutely focus on supporting your people.
And I think it's actually the onus should not necessarily be on the organization to do it, but on the benefit itself. And
Mm.
that's part of why I started Wave in the first place, is because I have a background in measurement-based care, which basically means that throughout an episode of care, you are consistently collecting data, progress data, and outcomes data on the people that you're working with. And this is actually, it's 35 years, 40 at this point, years of research behind it, as demonstrating that it prevents something that we call therapist drift, which
Oh,
is
yeah.
really keeps the focus of the work that you're doing on the table. It actually shortens the episodes of care so that it is actually far more efficient, and it really drives kind of better results. The problem is that many of the healthcare benefits platforms out there tend to not worry about building the technology to support measurement based care until the employer starts to ask for it. Because I think
Hmm.
employers were, especially during the pandemic, were really desperate to make sure that people had access to care, meaning a person who was there to answer the call, rather than looking at, is the care that we're providing good? Is it quality? Is it based in outcomes data? Can it actually demonstrate that ROI? And I do think there's a real shift in employers right now, as I can tell you, I'm selling to them all the time, where they are now starting to ask those really relevant and important questions because we just don't want to throw mental health care at the wall and hope it sticks. We want to ensure that we are providing high quality care because you're not going to get any of those benefits from a human or from an ROI perspective if you're not actually providing something that works.
Well, I think we've, made the case for demonstrating the ROI, demonstrating the impact, and for both the business case, the human case of why this all matters. Let's talk a little bit more about some specific actionable tips for mental wellness that employers can really put in place to support their employees. So, assuming we can make that case, we can show how it impacts. What can we really do to move the needle to make sure that we're proactively supporting our people, that we're not waiting until someone's had a complete burnout episode. We're not waiting until some real crisis moment, but we're proactively making sure that we're taking care of our people.
Absolutely. And I think that you said something that was really interesting in your intro as well, which was that there also feels like there's this shift in workplace culture where employees are really starting to expect mental health to be a topic of conversation. And I think this is fundamentally important. It's also why we started with Gen Z, because
Mm,
Gen Z is the generation who's driving that discussion into culture where, you ask someone my age or above, like we show up to work, we do our job. A discussion of mental health doesn't belong in the workplace, but
yeah.
now it's almost expected. And so what can we do? I think we can kind of take advantage of those trends and take advantage of that drive to start incorporating, to stop separating our work life and our home life so discreetly. Because this idea that like we show up at work as this automaton, we cut off anything that's happened to us, we do our job, we then go home and then we deal with our real lives, I think is a really big mistake. And I think it's a fallacy. I think if I have a huge fight with one of my kids or my partner, and then I show up to work, I can deal and I can cope and I can do my job, but it will actually impact and affect how I show up. So I
Yeah.
think the first thing that you can do very proactively is to start involving mental health into the conversation as something that is normal. It's something that is like we acknowledge that everyone has things happening to them outside of the workplace. We don't try to ignore it. In my company, we do check-ins every day. This is actually something that we offer and we integrate into the Wave platform as well. Every single internal meeting that we have, we do some sort of check-in. It can be abstracted, it can be super discreet, but we ask, give me some indication of how you're doing today.
Mhm.
And if that's in a 20-person meeting, we might do it rapidly. And it might be like, what color do you most identify with today? If you're in a small, more intimate meeting where you really know the team well, that might be like, where's your stress level? But having that moment of mindfulness to be able to check in with, where am I today? And how am I actually going to demonstrate that as data to the other people around me can go a huge way to not only check in with yourself, but also to actually share out and make other people aware. It improves communication exponentially. And it's something that we've actually built into our platform to do within Slack or to do within Workplace or to do within Teams. So it's all integrated into our platforms as well, which I think is really fundamentally important. Um, Other things that we can do, I think, really start from the hiring, is trying to ensure that the people who are in your organization have transparent information about what the culture is like so they can assess whether or not it's a good fit for them. And I know that this is something, there's a ton of privilege with that comment, right? Is that sometimes we're
Mhm.
just trying to get people in to fill the jobs. But ultimately, I think that if we put a little bit more mindfulness into our hiring practices, if we were really transparent about what people can expect from their workplace, what are the expectations that this manager has for their employee? Is there a goodness of fit between the employee and the culture and the manager? You would see a lot less burnout that is caused by the system itself rather than just the individual coming in with some mental health problem. So it is really important for organizations to understand how the individual and the system are going to interact, and to start assessing those things, looking at them a little bit differently. So that's something that we really try to impart to our HR teams as well.
Yeah. Well, I love all those suggestions and tips, and the check-ins. It's super simple, but it's something that shows that you genuinely care about your people, that you see them, that you recognize that they're people, that they have outside lives, that they bring that with them, that they matter. This whole idea of like check yourself at the door, leave home at home. That old school mentality. That's kind of crazy. I'm not sure that ever really worked, but it certainly in this day and age does not work. Our lives bleed together, and we just need flexibility. We need flexibility both ways. We need flexibility between work and home life and how they meld, and we can't just assume that we can keep them separate. If you happen to have a job, I've had jobs like this earlier in my life, in another, life long ago. I worked in a factory. I had a job where I worked on a farm. I had a job where I worked construction. I had those jobs when I was younger, saving money to go to college and working summers and that kind of stuff. Those jobs were a little different, and those jobs were the type where I could go to work, do the job, go home, do my home stuff back and forth, right? But in the knowledge economy, that's not how it is. Like it completely bleeds together all the time. And no matter how much I try to put boundaries up so that work doesn't always bleed into home life and vice versa, it still does. And it's really hard to keep those things separate, even if that's my intention. And so we just have to acknowledge that, I can't, just like I cannot stop stresses at work from bleeding into home, I cannot stop stresses from home bleeding into work. And if
Absolutely.
my employer can't acknowledge that, then they can pay for my therapy bills at home because I mean, goodness, it certainly, I mean, they can pay for anything that to help me get better sleep at night because certainly, work related stress contributes to sleep challenges for countless people, around the world, and all of those sorts of things. So we just need to acknowledge it, right?
I think so. And I think to your earlier point, COVID shined a light on this better than anything when no one could physically separate their
Hmm.
work life from their home life. It was, you saw kids and dogs and cats and noises disrupting all the time. And I think that was sort of this incredible spotlight on this idea that yes, during COVID, it's impossible to separate the environments, but it's really a fallacy. It's really kind of this false idea that you can truly separate your work self from your home self. And I agree. I think we should normalize it and stop pretending. I think there's also this sort of this belief that if people are showing up and give space, and this is sort of I think a human belief that if people show up and are able to give space to their emotions or what is happening, that it will start to bleed, it'll get out of control, it'll somersault, they won't be able to turn it off. And it's just not true. We know from
Yeah.
stats of clinical psychology research that acknowledging your emotions, especially your negative, your tough emotions, is the only way to actually let them sort of ride the wave and dissipate so
Mm.
that you can then engage with whatever values-based action you want to take. And I think that that's paramount. I can give you an example is that I have an employee who is actually lives kind of in the epicenter of the hurricane and is
Uh-huh.
just getting inundated with some really terrible news from friends and family around her. And yesterday she sort of showed up and as we how are you, and when we say how are you, we mean that it's an invitation to tell us. And she's like, I'm not so good today. And I was like, what do you need? I was like, do you need to postpone this meeting? Do you need to cancel it? Can you tell me what she said, no, what I need to do, I think is I'll see. Thank you for the space. And as we started talking and kind of worked through our agenda, like the ability to acknowledge where she was and then actually re-engage her brain and her mind allowed her to participate fully in our work productive meeting and ended up being a really needed and wanted distraction, which made her feel better. So again, it's being able to acknowledge our humanity in the workplace instead of being scared that our humanity is something that is going to be antithetical to productivity. I think is just fundamentally important.
This has just been a really great conversation, Sarah. I note the time, which has just completely flown by. We've only scratched the surface. There's like so much more we could talk about. but I also need to let you get on with your busy day. Before we wrap things up for now, I wanted to give you a chance to share with the audience how they can connect with you, find out more about your work, your team, and then give us the final word on the topic for today.
Yeah, great. So people can find me. LinkedIn's the best place to get me. I think I'm at Dr. Sarah Adler, is my handle on LinkedIn. There are a lot of Sarah Adlers on LinkedIn, but I think I'm the only doctor. Or email me at sarah@wavelife.io. Find out more about the platform that we're building that we think is really bringing a different kind of modern way of looking at mental health into the workplace, which is incredibly exciting. And I think the final word on the topic is just keep the conversation going, right? Is that
Yeah.
again, continue to not fear emotion, to can not fear our true authentic selves when we can show up as our true authentic selves with some guidelines, with some barriers around that.
Sure.
With some coping skills and strategies and actual skills around that, we will have more productivity and more humanity in the workplace. Those two things are not, they can exist simultaneously.
Thank you so much, Sarah. It's been a real pleasure. I encourage the audience to reach out, to get connected, find out more about what Sarah and her team can do for you. And as always, I hope everyone can stay healthy and safe, that you can find meaning and purpose at work each and every day. And I hope you all have a great week.
Thank
Thanks for joining us for this episode of the podcast. We hope you stay healthy and safe, and please join us again soon.